Thank you. Thanks ever so much for that, and thanks for coming. You're a test audience, because this is the first time I've done this, and I've got to do it in Hay-on-Wye at a book festival and in Edinburgh, okay? And I always have a tendency of showing too many slides, but I'm really interested in you telling me what I should do differently, as well as asking questions and what you make of this. I'm a geographer who looks at numbers, quantitative geographer. So I'm comfortable when you can count things. I'm going to show you some of the work I did before the next crisis first, so you get an idea of the kinds of things that interest me. The next crisis is a kind of teaser of a title. It's using the word crisis to kind of get you interested. But it's also a hopeful book, because I've recently been writing fairly unhopeful books about the UK. It's not my fault. The UK has not been in a very good place the last few years, I'd argue. So I wanted to write a book which isn't as depressing as writing about the current state of Britain, because a lot of things in the world are not that depressing. My youngest child proofread it for me, and his summary was, it's truthful but hopeful. So we'll see. I'm just showing you a map there because I'm a geographer, and there's going to be one other map, but you might get upset if I don't show you any maps. This is a map of the world's children. It's the countries of the world stretched so that each child gets an equal amount of space. So if you like, that's a different way of looking at the planet. We are a tiny archipelago, slightly bulbous, but that's the southeast of England maybe. And we're shrinking all the time. Not as fast as most of Europe is shrinking, but really our place in the world here in the UK is going back to the kind of size it was relatively 500 years ago. The largest place in the world is India, Pakistan. There's detail on the map. You can see Chongqing, the biggest city in the world, which is in China. So these are the kind of things that interest me. Where are people? Where's the future people, children? And how do we see things? Now I'm going to tell you about a couple of earlier books and issues, and then I'll get on to the next crisis. But there's the cover. I do worry that George Monbiot hasn't read it and won't agree with everything in the book, but he's had a nice thing about it at the top. If you've got good eyesight, you can read that. It's garish. What colour would you say that cover is? Yellow. You're yellow, yeah. Somebody told me it was green the other day. No, yeah. So the science publishers want to get attention. Crisis yellow. Of course, it's published by Verso, hence the red and black. If you know, more left-wing books tend to be red and black. And what you're going to be getting is about what are people's concerns about the future, or my take on data, putting them in a particular order, and then saying why we should worry about that, and hopeful things about it. I haven't got any copies because it's not published until the 16th of May. So we're 2 weeks before publication date. This is the kind of thing I did before. This book came out about 4 years ago called Slow Down. The title gives it away. It's about how most things in the world are slowing down, which is not what you normally hear. You normally hear everything's accelerating, it's getting faster, and so on. I tried to look at as many data series as I could over time. Much easier than drawing maps, just looking at things changing over time. And I only found 4 things which were accelerating. One of them is carbon emissions, which is what you're seeing here. So it's not just going up, it's going up a little bit faster on average each year than the year before. That's not good news, I'm sure. Well, I'm going to show you a graph later, which will show why I'm fairly sure you all know about carbon emissions, because more people in the UK know and worry about carbon emissions than anywhere else in the world. But that's a conventional graph of the billions of tons of carbon being emitted in the world per year. See going up? We've got time on the bottom. We've got the amount of carbon on the side. Now, the kind of thing I do is take graphs and look at them a different way. Uh, and I'm really unsure whether I should do this for a large audience at the book festival or not. This is exactly the same data. Okay? But now we don't have time on an axis. Time is as it travels through. You've still got on the vertical axis the amount of carbon being emitted. So that's going up and up and up. But along the bottom, you've got how much that's increasing in a year or decreasing. And it shows you all little wiggles. It shows you that it isn't that it's always going up. When we get a worldwide recession, the amount tends to go down. Sadly, just after we have the Rio Summit Accord or the Kyoto one or the one in Paris, just after we made an agreement about emissions tend to go up. We think we've done something. But it slopes towards the right. So we have a problem with carbon emissions worldwide. Although we do lots of saying we're doing things about it, and lots of solar farms, and lots of moving to wind, and lots of using gas instead of coal, partly because we've used up all the coal, we tend to be more and more energy hungry, and we tend to emit more. So there's a problem, something you might think of as a crisis. I'm going to show you something which is one of the main things I've worked on over the last 30 years, which is population next. The main thing I've worked on is inequality, which is why I get so depressed, which I'll come to in a minute. Population's the opposite. Population is wonderful. Population, from my point of view, is quite incredible, just how many people there are. Because something really, really unusual began to happen shortly after 1968. When I say really unusual, I mean first time in the history of a species unusual. You know, our species is maybe 200,000 years old. We're a very, very young species. You're humanists, so you are experts on thinking about a species that's one of the most recent species on Earth. And for almost all the history of our species, we were largely growing in number. Just a little bit, not very much. You might be aware of a graph that has a very low number, 3,000 years ago, hardly goes up, and it goes like this, and it looks like we're rocketing off. Now, I'm not showing you that. I'm showing you that graph turned around again to make you think about the changes. This data is a few years old for the United Nations, when we thought we were going to hit about 10.5 billion in 30 or 40 years from now. We're now about 8 billion people. And the incredible thing is this stopping around about 1980 in it rising more and more, still rising by 80 million a year. And then now, in the years we're in now, the increase in human beings actually being less each year than the year before. The latest data doesn't get us to 10.5 billion. Latest data gets us a bit lower by about the year 2084. So I'm not going to, if you can work out how old you might be in 2084, there are people in this room who will be alive, more likely the women than the men. There are people in this room who are going to be alive at very likely the first time in human history that human population falls, or in a sense becomes stable. It probably didn't fall during the Black Death worldwide, because the Black Death was actually only parts of the world. It's a very odd thing. It's quite, I think, fairly good news. I mean, I'm an optimist. I think we could probably, if we were really well organized, the world could cope with 15 billion, maybe even 20 billion of us. If we were wonderful, cooperative human beings, we could have 30 billion people not eating meat, but we're not that good. So actually stabilizing at around 10 billion can give you all kinds of hope for the future. The question is, how did it happen? I'm going to do another trick, and I really want you to be honest later with me and just say, Danny, just show one or two graphs. Don't do this to people, right? That's your responsibility. You are responsible for the future upsetness of audiences over the next 8 or 9 months. But let's take the same graph and do another thing to it. All we're doing here is just putting log scale on. It might scare you from memories of school. Anybody remember slide rules? Yeah, excellent. Yes. You don't even know what a slide rule is, do you? No, that's incredible, do you? No. You wait until the real power outage goes and there's no, like in Spain, and your inability to use the slide rule, you're going to be in trouble. Slide rules worked on logs now before the calculator. Right. The scale goes from 1 to 10 to 100 to 1,000, okay? Exactly the same data as that runaway train graph that I haven't shown you, but basically highlights three main events going on in human history. The first is shortly after 1492. That's three little ships heading off across the Atlantic, carrying some germs and people associated with the germs, but the important thing were the germs. Arriving in the Caribbean, the germs moved ahead of the people. The people were not particularly nice. They were quite savage. They were us, Europeans, but it was our germs that really slaughtered maybe 60 million people in South America, which is why the conquest of South America is so easy, because if you've got a population, absolutely dying from unknown diseases, which probably included a common cold, it would have been a coronavirus. It's not that hard with your swords to take over. Population of the world didn't fall, but the increase slowed, and it's a major global event, 1492. The second major global event, bless you, to mention the common cold, and then you go and do it. We're always learning new things, by the way. Until COVID-19, we had no idea what a coronavirus pandemic was like. We know we've had them in the past because we've got 4 common colds now. There's been many others. We tended to assume that they must have entered quite gently, right? Now we know. You can look back at previous what we thought were flu pandemics and go, actually, it doesn't look that much like flu. Anyway, 1492. The next one, anybody want to guess? 1820, 1830, 1840. Why there was a sudden decrease in the growth of population?
India?
Yeah, India. And
Messing it up.
Yes, us messing up India, not just India, whole of the continent of Africa, but yes, certainly India. Famines. This was Europeans, again. Principally this time, it was us, right, rather than the Portuguese and the Spanish and so on more. We did walk in uninvited to 90% of the current members of the United Nations and disrupt fairly stable social systems around the world, at the most extreme being Australia. For hundreds and thousands of years, not all kind of absolutely harmonious, but people had ways of keeping society the same, of controlling population growth. You had customs and marriage and things you did. Invading armies completely disrupt that. The first thing you get is a slowdown in population growth, but the next thing you then get is a huge boom. So the current rise from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 to 6 billion has a lot to do with the imperial expansion of European empires. But this isn't to talk about that. It's the next bit. What on earth happened after 1968 and so on? And the trite answer is contraception and the pill and the condom. But it was really growing power of women worldwide, because this isn't disease or wars. This is actually people choosing to have fewer children everywhere in the world and slowing it down. Enough about that, because this is still introduction. We're not going to take all night. I've had to show you a few things about Britain. The book I wrote last year is called Shattered Nation. It's a book I had to write. It was an odd book. I'll just show you some pictures from it. This is the inequality graph of the UK from around about 1910 to 2020. If you go back to 1910, the top line is the best off 1% of the 1%, the very richest people. That group, the very richest, used to have an income from their investments, not from working. Nobody gets lots of money, actually is getting their money from working. From their investments, which are often overseas, which was 400 times the average. When you've got an income that's 400 times the average income, you can have a very large mansion, and you can have a lot of servants because you pay them less than the average income, right? That came down and down and down, incredibly steadily, really, when you look at that graph, And it's a log scale again because it was so enormous, the redistribution of income that occurred in the UK, that by the time you get to late 60s, 70s, there aren't any servants left because the rich don't have enough money to employ them. And then turns around, late 1970s, up again, and now we're at a really interesting period where hopefully we're at a peak again. But you never know you're at a peak. It's like climbing up a mountain in fog. Right? You don't know you're at a peak until you've gone down for a decent amount of time. I'm hopeful that we're at a peak. Yeah, so this may be the most complicated, but probably the most useful. But I'm going to get you to be honest with me about this over my addiction to graphs. Why is the UK shattered? Why aren't things good? This is my favourite graph. The red line is us. It's at the bottom. This is data from the IMF. IMF are a fairly reputable, not that exciting organisation, International Monetary Fund. It's the proportion of GDP, which is gross national product, similar to income, being spent on public services. So of all these European countries, we tax and spend the least. The red line is now higher than it used to be. So our taxation rate is at the highest level for 70 years or whatever. But compared to other European countries, it's low. This is give or take a bit of borrowing. If we go back, this is 1980. Margaret Thatcher didn't like public services, so cuts the amount of money being spent on them. Lovely John Major gets in, my favourite Prime Minister. I don't know why I like John, but decent Tory. Blair gets in 1997. We follow conservative spending plans for 2 years, so no increase in public spending, then a bit of increase on NHS and putting nice new windows into council houses very quietly. Then a big rise. That's the banking crisis, 2008. Everybody has to bail out the banks. Then austerity and George Osborne. COVID, which is that rise. And the great thing about the IMF data is that every country tells the IMF what they're going to do in the next 2 years ahead. So they might not do it, and it's not good. Now, these differences, this is a percent. These differences are enormous. You know, there are enormous differences in the funding of schools and hospitals and housing, roads. You know, so we've got across Europe a huge range of societies doing things differently. And you can be, one day I'll manage to do a right-wing version of this where I'll tell you how absolutely awful Belgium is and that there's no civilization in France and that Finland and Norway are just basket cases because they tax people. Nobody invents anything there. Denmark, Austria, Sweden, terrible places. Greece, Italy, Germany, basket case, you know. But things work like the trains on the continent. We have chosen to be there. We have these special fiscal rules. Gordon Brown helped invent them. They've changed 10 times. So they're kind of rules that aren't rules that say you can't possibly go out of this narrow thing. Gordon used to go on holiday to America, and Americans spend even less. If you spend low on public services and you don't actually sort out the population's problem, you might get economic growth. It doesn't matter. They're still going to vote for Trump. Right? It's my basic politics of Britain. Don't do it. It's dangerous. Why are we so weird? Part of the clue is the other two countries that were weirder than us, which was Spain, very early. Spain shortly after Franco, after the dictatorship, and Greece after the generals, right? You've got to be undemocratic because it's in the interest of the vast majority of the population to have high public spending. Only a few people earn so much money that this taxation is going to make them think, oh, this is unfair. So the only way you can get it that low is by not having a democracy. We've got a democracy. It's great. We have a system called first past the post. It's really good. Makes people want to vote. So I shouldn't be cynicism. And us and Iran have, well, you're like this because you're humanists. You all know how important it is to have clerics, priests in your legislature, right? That's called democracy. And unbelievably, of the current Labour Party's 17 pledges of the really important things they're going to do, one of the most urgent things that this government's going to do in its first year was to make sure that some women bishops got into the House of Lords. Right? if you really want a sign of not getting your priorities right, and thinking that that's progress. Anyway, it's preaching to the converted. It's just a very bad joke. As I'll be amazed if anybody goes here. No, there should be more women bishops. Couple of quotes for you that I won't read out, but you can see why I was getting depressed, or it's getting too easy. For somebody who's mostly written on inequality, it was getting too easy to say it's really, really bad. Because people like these two were saying it. I thought until recently that it had been almost a decade since any politician in Britain has actually claimed that things were getting better seriously. But somebody last week told me that apparently the current government has made some claim that something's getting better. I missed it. So if any of you saw it, but it's a sad situation we're in. You know, we're the most unequal country in Europe, give or take Bulgaria. We're back to 1930s levels of inequality. It's not good. So this is all preamble, probably too much to say, why am I going to look at worldwide issues and not Britain anymore? And mean things. I should have brought this. This is a 17-foot-long silk print of the Universal Credit Regulations that we make people click through when they're trying to claim benefit. Let's click through again. Last thing was a book I did in September last year. I do too many books. I'm slowing down. This is a book about 7 typical children in the UK and how much money they have and what their lives are like. And what's different about this is that half the book is written as fiction. That's really hard to do, is what I discovered. Here's the incomes of 7 typical children. Just very quickly for you, there were 14 million children in 2018 when I started this. I grouped them into 7 groups of 2 million, depending on their parents' income, and I took the middle child of each. So I'm ignoring the richest million children and the poorest million, but they're spread across the income distribution, but they're typical. So child number 7, their family has the same disposable income after rent and mortgage and after tax as child number 1, 2, or 3. That's what gross inequality means. Because often you say things like we're the most unequal, but you have to see it, what it means. The shock is child number 7, who's called Gemma. Mum and dad run a corner shop. Their income after tax is £25,000 each. So the family won £50,000 after paying tax and after paying quite a small mortgage in their case. Same as a couple of secondary school teachers. So our rich kid isn't that rich because there's a million above her. The families of the million above Gemma are taking half of that entire pie, right? Or if you look very, very, you can hardly see it, but there are some very little grey lines here, which is each percentile. And there's 2 up there, which are the 1% and 2%, which get cut off. The 2% goes up to about 120, and the average income of the best off 1% of children is, where's it going to be? 621,000 over there, right? Boris Johnson, at the moment, not when he's Prime Minister, when he was slumming it on a much lower salary. So very sad, very unequal situation. We're in the worst cost of living crisis since the first we ever measured, which was 1798. We almost got out of it. We almost got back to 2008 levels, and then the prices went up towards the end of the pandemic. And our inequality is incredibly high, and New Labour didn't dent it. Moved 1 million children who were almost out of poverty, just out of poverty. Looks good on the statistics, took 1 million children out of poverty, but if you take the million who are nearest to the poverty line, their families don't actually feel the effect of just going over the line. The idea was to move 4 million, starting with the first million, but I can't believe they were ever actually that serious. And it's like living with high blood pressure, living with that level of inequality. There's good news, and we're heading towards the next crisis. That inequality curve is actually going down a little bit for the United Kingdom. It's going down for most countries in Europe. This is the Gini coefficient. fact, in most of the world, most countries are getting slightly more equal. Worldwide inequalities, if you forget the 50 billionaires at the top and the poorest, maybe 500 million people, our lives are getting more similar to each other. But we're up there. The saddest graph, or the most shameful one, is this one here. This is all the countries the United Nations measures poverty in. But this is amazing. This is 7 years, around about 2014 to 2021, the latest UN data. And these are the falls in the proportion of children who are poor. Right? And this is why I want to look at the world, because it's incredible. Things that are going on worldwide are absolutely incredible. We tend to concentrate on really bad things, like the 2% of the population of the world who are women in America who lives in their rights. Right? And it's really bad, but that's only 2% of the world population. Most women in the world are gaining rights in most countries. We just don't count it. Or another way of looking at it, or that I wish I'd do, we always report the rise of the far right. We never report when the far right in a country lose support, when they do badly in Poland, when they do badly in Greece. They haven't been going up every year for the last 35 years. It's just that's the newspaper stories you read, because it's reported when they do well. It's not reported when they do badly. But this is shameful, because our child poverty rate was already high, and then we had the biggest increase in it. So we are in a particularly bad situation. And those countries just beneath, Iceland, France, Switzerland, and Norway, had some of the lowest rates in the world. So that rise is on a very low rate. So there's something sticking out like a sore thumb about the UK. Now let's go away from the UK. Good. And look at what people worry about and worry about worldwide. So we're going to be going largely global now, and we're going to do this in less than 20 minutes, okay? So, crises. It's a fairly simple thing to do. Maybe it's too commonly done. Any of you can just type Google N-grammar, put in a word, and see how often was that word used since whatever 1800. I've done it for different versions of the word crisis in different languages, but you tend to get the same thing. The word crisis was not used very much until a bit of a crisis in the 1930s, down a bit, and then zooms up in the 60s and never goes down again. And the nice thing about this graph is it ends in 2019. So you absolutely know that it's going to go, it has to go, it'll go stratospheric, well, once we got the COVID years in. I think, it's fashion in words, but this 1820s, 1830s, all the way through, this is a time of continuous crisis. This is wars across Europe, pandemic and epidemic after, so many diseases, cholera, things happening. Crisis was continual, so it wasn't seen as crisis, it's just life. People sometimes say that pandemics are increasing. So the minute you measure them, you go, actually, the numbers are going, they're becoming less and less frequent. COVID in 2019, possibly AIDS, you can think of as a big, slow-burning pandemic. The last big flu was 1918. The ones after them were 1968, 1977, tiny swine flu, 210. It's quite interesting that the number of human beings on the planet is so high, but the number of diseases has gone down. Why these series of crises? There's a Cuban Missile Crisis, a nuclear war. But I think life became stable enough for people to spend time worrying, which is a good thing. And we discovered things like global warming that hardly anybody knew about in the 60s and really wasn't believed until the 70s or 80s and not believed by most people until 2000s. Mass species extinction, we kind of discovered these things, or we have the luxury of worrying about them. And then this is the last map. I'll show it you again. It's the data from nice academics in Sweden who count up every death that could be attributable to war since 1989. And so it's a world map of who's died in wars. And, and most of the weapons used to kill most of these people were not made in those countries. And we're involved in a lot of them. still, that hasn't ended. Okay, now, what I do in the book is talk about what are the current biggest crises in the world, and then I end with what might be the next one, which of course I can't get right. You can't speculate. I do look at people whose job it is to speculate on what's going to be the next big crisis and how often they get it wrong. And interestingly, there's a group at Davos who are risk managers who always produce a report saying what's going to happen bad next year, which is brave of them. And for a couple of years, they had one of the biggest ones was going to be cyber attack or something, which, and in fact, our biggest cyber attack was actually some cyber security software itself failing, if you remember. Not now. Spain may not. The problem is, if it was a cyber attack, they wouldn't tell you because you don't want to be scared. But could be. Oh, and the sort of things people worry about are asteroids and these things. Really, very, very unlikely. We could argue about it. Ipsos Mori, for many, many years, have done polling around the world in 30 countries. The Chinese Academy of Sciences has done this. So I've been looking, and India is included. So I've been looking at polls for at least half the population of the world of what people worry about. The small print is here. Which three of the following topics do you find the most worrying in your country? And the results differ if you don't say in your country and if you use a word other than worrying. And you can do polls where you talk about a specific thing, like nuclear war, and you can get the majority of the world telling you that they're worried about nuclear war if you trigger them, right? So I'm sure most of you 2 hours ago were not worrying about most of these things. You'd have been worrying about something, hopefully, because that's what we do as humans. Always worry about people who don't worry. Although they're probably very happy, or you got no memory left. Nice things about certain diseases is at least you don't worry anymore when you can't remember. But yeah, most of us do not have a set of worries that we put in a hierarchy, but then we're asked, what do you worry about? And these 18 are a set of standard ones. I won't bore you about the slight changes over time, just to say that inequality and poverty has been at the top worldwide and very high in Britain for at least 10 years. The cost of living crisis came in, but it's very similar to inequality and poverty. Right? Cost of living crisis is much less of an issue if you've got a more equal society, because you're all in it together. If you've got great inequality and the price of eggs goes up, the people at the bottom cannot have eggs, right? Whereas if you've got much more equality, everybody has one less egg, right? What I did is just put the top two together, cost of living inequality and poverty, as the dominant current crisis in the world and in the UK. When you ask people, it's getting by. It's literally, how am I going to get by? And so I have a whole section on that worry. The second one, which 10 years ago was actually the first, is what am I going to do? Who's going to need me? Unemployment. Being afraid of not being wanted, not getting a job. If you're young, it's not stereotype you, but what am I going to do in 10 years' time? Who's going to want me? But also, my age. I'm lucky in the university I'm in. If I wasn't in the University of Oxford, and I was in, you could pick a university at random in the UK, Russell Group, I'll be worrying that I am a liability because I'm expensive at the age of 57. It's a real worry. I've lumped in immigration with that because often people's concerns about immigration are superficially, these people are going to come and take our jobs, which is a bit silly because what happens if you get people coming is it creates jobs. But we'll talk about that later. But it's fairly obvious. Somebody comes to Leeds from another country and does some work in the University of Leeds. That means that a corner shop is going to get somebody turning up at the corner shop buying something. It's a multiplier effect, right? Immigrants create jobs. If people leave, you lose jobs. Crime, violence is the third worry, and I've added war and corruption and those kind of things. And there's a lot of worry about crime. It varies usually by country. So number one crime worry at the moment is Sweden. Partly because the Swedes don't have other things to worry about, but partly I'm stoked up a bit, but also there's some crime. And then cradle to the grave issues, healthcare, taxes, education. Number one worry in China is healthcare. And again, a bit like Sweden, because quite a lot of things are well sorted out in China. And they've got a generally pretty happy population because they know the situation their grandparents lived in and their parents. But you may well have to pay a bribe to get your grandparents treated properly in a hospital in China. I understand. I do want to be allowed to go to China, but how else do you explain it being such a concern in China about? And then, and this is by me lumping them together, climate crisis still only comes number 6, originally 8. It's low. And these are Ipsos polls, which means they're largely being done at the world's middle class. Right? Half the world's population are not polled. They have everyday concerns, which are basically getting through the day. So climate crisis is down there. I'm not saying it should be down there, but it's a far away in time and space crisis to the everyday. And then lastly, I've stuck biodiversity and threats to the environment in, because some people would argue actually the biggest crisis isn't climate. That's a problem for 200 or 300 years, but we're never going to get the species back that have been destroyed. And then I have too many graphs, which I'm not going to say much about at all. Cost of living crisis, you have a set of economists who tell you we've never been better off. Absolute poverty is the lowest it's ever been in the world. This really isn't useful. It's saying that people who are getting $10 or $15 or $20 a day are okay. It's not a useful thing, but I'm not going to spend time on this unless anybody wants to go back to it. Unemployment. Here's a quote from somebody working at university. A fear of quite posh people. We often don't talk about our innermost worries much. It's kind of like embarrassing. And of course, a lot of our everyday worries are our family, relationships, other things. What is that boil on my foot? That kind of thing. But this is general. So unemployment is a worry. Just one graph for you on the UK. Only 4 things over, I think it was something like 130 polls ever got to be highest, and they're these kind of ones. But too many graphs, and I'm going to finish in 5 or 6 minutes. War. That map again, something about Sweden. The countries that border the Ukraine, of course, war's a big concern for them and only rose after the invasion of the Ukraine. It's actually terrorism is what people in Israel tick rather than war, and that's the off-the-scale one that you can see. But in a lot of countries, fear about war is much, much less. Crime is higher because it's near and every day, right? And you can change how much people worry by talking about these things. I'm not going to talk about migration. Cradle to the grave issues. This first graph is about the United States. So just trying to explain how bad things are in the United States. This comes from the Atlantic magazine. This is age. This is the US compared to other affluent countries in the world. A baby is twice as likely to die on average. Children are twice as likely. By the time you get into your 20s and 30s, you're heading to being 4.5 times as likely to die. This is fentanyl, road crashes, a bit of guns, mostly which people shoot themselves with the guns. Despair, drugs. You have to go all the way down till you get to about age 100, and people in the US become the same. That's essentially being 100 is a kind of a liability to living. This one is incredible. This was done by John Berg Murdoch. These are the richest 1% of people in America and the average length they live to. And it's the same as us. And we're one of the worst countries in Europe. So the well-off in America really aren't getting, this is the top 1%. Yeah, it's quite incredible. And they're the ones with access to the private healthcare. But still, American society is such a mess. It's not good. Oh, okay. I had a look at conspiracy theories, which is, of course, another set of worries. And it's interesting. partly because YouGov tested a series of conspiracy theories and how many people believed in them, one of which turned out not to be a conspiracy between when they put the poll out and when they got the results, which was the Russian interference in the election in America. So the problem with conspiracy theories is you never quite know if they're true or not. I like this one, or I shouldn't. You can see what YouGov were getting at. But if you do ask people, is there a secretive group of people who meet and really run the world? Well, there are people who meet on yachts. Peter Mandelson was all over them in the early 2000s. Big decisions about like going to war were made by Bush and Blair. My university is full of people meeting to discuss important things that the little people wouldn't understand. So I do worry when you take a poll like this. Would you say, regardless of who is officially in charge of governments and other organisations, there's a single group of people who secretly control events and rule the world together? If you think, well, the ruling class rule the world together, it's not an unreasonable thing to. Well, it's a self-definition, But what they're trying to get at is Illuminati and anti-Semitism. And those are interesting. This is climate change as a hoax, and I think this is if you want the thing to be proud about the UK, the decision of the media organisations, including Sky, not to do balanced reporting, the decisions of all the political parties. The Tories are always on the edge over it, and obviously Nigel Farage is trying to win by being different by not. But we are the country that least thinks that climate change is a hoax. There are enormous inequalities in emissions, quite staggering inequalities in emissions. The richest 1% of the 1% are going out of their way to emit enormous amounts of carbon. So if you redistribute, you don't have super yachts burning diesel. Almost all the activities of very rich people flying around in private jets geared up, inefficiently heating homes they're not even in, to wasting carbon, which kind of brings us slowly in the conclusion. We're in Leeds. East Bradford's not very far away. I don't know, maybe 4 miles away. This banner was produced in early 1914. It's the East Bradford's Socialist Sunday School. Maybe actually I hadn't thought about this, but so you may not know about the Socialist Sunday School movement. You're more likely than anybody else to. People still wanted Sunday schools back then because you do want to get the kids out on a Sunday morning. But for people who didn't want them getting the 10 Commandments, which some of the 10 Commandments, they're not killing stuff. I'm okay here, I've got to be general. What's I think is always interesting about the 10 Commandments is the kind of ones that you can really sell at the beginning. Love thy neighbour, don't kill people. By the time you get down to Commandment 9 or 10, you're into don't fancy your neighbour's slave, as and wife and ox and covet and some stuff about property. And really, I always wonder who stuck and why did they put the ones that are hard to sell at the bottom of that? Anyway, there's the alternative 10 from the Socialist Sunday School movement from a century ago. I suspect there are hardly any Socialist Sunday Schools left. But my optimism is that we've spent 200 or 300 years, you can go back to diggers and levelers and other things, trying to work out how to be nicer to each other, be cooperative, not be nasty, not have crises of this kind. And I do think that we have a growing proportion of people in the world who do think it makes sense to do this, partly because fewer people think we're going to be looked after by God. That an upside of the reduction in people believing that there is some almighty, and if you just behave by a set of rules, you'll be okay. Where the biggest group of people who don't believe in God is China, highest number of atheists and agnostics in the world. But a general rise, you might worry about evangelicals and what's happening, but overall, my grandparents would absolutely have believed in chapel. The question was, what kind of a Methodist were you? That's what mattered, not that you were going to be one or not. And once you don't believe in that, the question is, what do you believe in? What things do you want? I told you, this is our end, I told you right at the beginning, I was looking at the things which were accelerating, and there was only 4. One was carbon emissions. The next one was number of flights being taken, which went down during COVID, back up again. So people flying in the world. Well, not people. There isn't actually an increase in people, it's an increase in flights. So 25% of our flights in Britain are done by just 1% of the people who fly so often. Most of EasyJet and Ryanair passengers are ABC1. Worldwide, the number of people who don't fly every year increases, because the majority of the people being born in the world are never going to fly. But a small number of us fly more and more and more. So that's accelerating. Temperature, emissions and flights. And the 4th thing which is accelerating worldwide is university graduates. Now, that's going to have to come to an end, right? It's about a third. It obviously comes to an end, but I think it's really, really good. It's a bit like letting everybody go to grammar school. So, when we chucked them out, when we told people at 11 they didn't have it in them and they had to leave at 14, you're basically being told you don't understand the world, get into that mill and get working. When you let people carry on just a little bit longer, and places like this university, you're telling people you're clever enough to think about things. And then either they've all got to try to be like Elon, right? Or you've got to try and control people like Elon. So I'll end on that. I don't know if it's too simplistic. Thank you for your patience and let me test it out. And please ask any questions and please tell me how many of those slides to get rid of when I do this to a bigger audience. Thank you very much. You can shout out maybe, but we'll use the mic. Or advice about, go on. Yeah.
You have to put it right to your mouth. Okay. Switch it on.
One, I guess I would say advice, and then I'll have a question as well. I did like the graphs. I actually did like the way you explained it. I think it's the best way for you because you like graphs, and I think that it was the best way for you to explain things. However, I do think there's some, maybe not as many as you played.
Half as many. Who would get rid of more than half of them? Hands up. Who would get rid of?
To simplify the message.
Get rid of half. Who'd get rid of a third? Get rid of. Who thinks it's the right number of graphs?
I think it's fine. The only issue is when you skipped over a couple.
Yeah.
Because you start looking at it and then you go, okay, moving on.
So the ones I'm going to skip over, so I might have to get rid of a few.
So, I understand the ideas as you're explaining them. My visual imagery isn't that great, so
yeah.
The ideas are fine, the graphs are not. So when I'm listening to you and trying to follow the graphs, I'm looking at the graphs and saying, what is this? But your ideas are perfectly lucid, I just wonder whether that can be sort of balanced out somehow. So I very much doubt if I'm the only one who
No, you won't be. One interesting thing for me, I have a kind of I don't know, I'm of an age where nobody had any kind of special things about them, but I would describe it as attention deficit. I get really, really bored sitting still, so I need something to look at. But that's me, and I do it for me. Whereas I think you're much more usual in most people don't like graphs, but you're humanists, and maybe there's a correlation between evidence and
I'm just fascinated at how we put some of them together.
But ultimately, you want people to understand the point you're making and to respond to that.
Yeah.
You want the graphs to enable them not to hinder. You don't want people to think, oh, it's not a graph and switch off and not. So that's what you're trying to sort of figure out.
Yeah, trying to work it out.
The logarithmic scales as well, I was struggling with. I find it hard to visualise that when you're going.
Yeah.
I know why you're doing it, to avoid things being enormous. But
I might just get rid of those. I need to get rid of something. Yeah.
I love your graphs, but there's too many words on them.
Yep.
They're not simple enough. I particularly like, and my trade union would like, number 7. Remember that all good things are as a result of labour. Whoever enjoys them without work for them is stealing the bread of the worker.
Okay, yeah.
I think that's brilliant. And I think it just ought to be simplified more, so for it to be maybe prove that point, as it were.
Or if I took those 10, got rid of a lot of the text, but put them separately but on modern graphs, and then end up with that as the kind of punchline, and all of these coming from 100 years ago, so not being new. I don't know. Just came to my head as you like it. Could make it look less. Yeah.
I think you've got to remember that, I mean, if you're going to the Hay Festival, a lot of people will not be that young, and their eyesight may not be that good.
Yes.
So picking out what the key things in the graph, which is complicated, is very difficult.
Yes, I'll do that. And the other, I'm aware, there's a really important reason why all talks at Hay only last an hour, which is to do with the age of the audience, which is, anyway. Yeah.
Is there, so for instance, that Hay, is there a message that you're trying to drop there? Or is it just to increase curiosity about
It's mainly to increase curiosity, because they're going from talk to talk to talk. So you're just trying to get people interested and to remember that was a bit different, which may be a bit mercantile and a bit, but also people who go to book festivals, they tend to be older, and they really have their opinions. So when I go to schools and they're 16, 15, for me, it's brilliant. You've got to be very careful, but these are people forming their opinions. University, people in 18, 19, it's almost a little bit too late. It's really interesting. By the time you're going to a book festival, particularly the kind of people who go to a book festival, they absolutely have their set of beliefs about the world, and they might be the least likely to change. Unless you're changing an opinion about something that they haven't thought about at all, and showing them something surprising. Yeah.
In the list, just going back a few slides, in the list of things that people were, in the list of things that people were concerned about, worried about, we've got 18 of them.
Yeah.
I wonder where, like nowadays, you would put fear of technology, fear of, would it be in financial or political or?
Oh, that's really it. They don't ask, I don't think, any of them.
No.
Yes.
Whether or not, when that
and like AI. Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But it's also the question of the way you ask the question. I get very cherry sometimes because I will say, if done polls by YouGov and say, what are you concerned about immigration or blah, blah, blah. And I think, well, I actually think immigration is a good thing, but I know if I say I'm concerned about immigration, it will be coded as I'm on the Nigel Farage end of the spectrum. And I do think that one or two other categories where I think they could be coded that way.
Yeah.
That is a problem, the way questions are asked.
Yeah.
So you'd always want to know, and if you didn't say, but perhaps you assume we figure that what questions are they being asked, what do they understand the question, and therefore how do we interpret the data?
They're also trying to ask here, these 18 categories are ones that they can ask almost anywhere, and translate to other languages. And it's interesting in which countries they felt they couldn't ask some questions, which is like Turkey sometimes, or to do it. But yeah, I do have a section about AI, but this is it's really now maybe we've had 4 AI periods of crisis that I've known of. The first was 1968, when the idea was we first had some computer programming that could do it. And when I did my PhD in 1986, we had neural networks that could emulate a sea slug. So I've got real cynicism, because this is my 4th AI revolution. But there's always a fear that, it'll be the one where suddenly the monster's cleverer than you. But amongst publishers, and the intelligentsia, it's really high. And it's fascinating what things pretty well off people worry about. One is climate, and that's partly, I think, and certainly if you poll young people in Europe, they're very, very worried about climate. The poorer the young people get, the less worried they are. And it's partly, if you think everything else in your life is going to be okay, you're going to get a job, you're going to get a house, they're worrying that you're going to be living in an inhospitable country when you're old rises. AI really worries publishers because it's kind of like their job, and journalists, and so on.
But then there's the thing with AI. You just mentioned AI and job specifically, and again, you can be quite Janus oriented about that, because you say, okay, AI could take all the jobs, that's evil, or we could say AI could take most of the jobs, we'll have much more leisure time, isn't that wonderful?
Yeah.
And I would imagine, again, you could ask the question where you sort of background it, prime your audience and see what they actually say. And again, I would expect there to, if you did do it where you tried to angle that sort of disparity, you would get a very, very strong class differential.
Yeah.
Certainly something around the income.
Yeah.
I could be wrong, but intuitively I do.
The thing I love about,
actually looking at.
it would be. The thing I really love about the current AI is my university has a thing I hate, which is called tutorial essays, where they're made to write these essays, the undergraduates, every week. And AI kind of gets rid of this because ChatGPT can produce the best standard sitting in the middle of the fence Oxford tutorial essay. And it's different every time, so you can't spot it. What worries me the most about AI is that some of the nicest students and researchers I've ever worked with are from other countries and often speak and have learned 4 or 5 languages, and they've learned English as their 3rd or 4th. Their grammar's always better than mine. And the really sad thing that's just happening, it makes complete sense, but my students from, I won't say, we can guess which countries, but I'm not going to stereotype, but countries where it's a very different language, and they're doing a PhD in English. And you've just got, it'll correct your English, which is, now maybe I'm being really unfair. I happen to be born in the world language country, so I don't know any other languages. But these folk who come are really, really clever at many things, and they force themselves to understand this country by learning the language to a point where you can't tell they weren't born here. And suddenly you don't need to do that anymore, and you can pass. But go on. Yeah.
So obviously the book is talking about what we can do next. What do you think is something that we could do next with these crises?
I think there's a lot. I think the thing is realizing just how connected they are. In that you get more unemployment or more fear of not being needed when a few people have most of the money. So you're more likely to be expendable. Crime is lower in more equal countries. Carbon emissions are lower. They do, and maybe I'm too utopian about this, but there does seem to be a kind of win-win-win over just being nicer. Even things like, if it turned out that I eat meat, right? I'm not, right, but I know that eating meat is bad for me. If it turned out that eating meat was really good for you, that would be really bad news for the planet. But there are a whole lot of kind of fortunate things going on. Wars don't tend to solve things. Life doesn't get better when you produce lots of arms. And maybe I'm too trite about it. Doesn't mean we're going to get a nicer world. And there are a small number of people who really believe in themselves and that others aren't worth anything and that they should get more wealth. And if they don't get their way, their army should be allowed to invade somebody else's and so on. And I think that's our problem as a species, is we have this variation in ethics and morals, and we have a psychopathic minority who also some of them tend to be very greedy. Most people aren't. And given the way we run our world, if some people are inherently more greedy, they're going to end up with more money. And that turns out those people are not generally the nicest of individuals. Some of them are quite good at doing a PR that sells them, and people have advised them to do nice things like fund inoculation programs around the world. But so I'm thinking of Bill Gates. He's not going to care about me saying this. But even Bill Gates, not a particularly kind character. His dad was rich. He didn't really invent a computer system, and it wasn't very good, MS-DOS and all that. He was very good as an accountant and getting a monopoly. But I worry that there's a tendency for people who are not very nice to end up with lots of power and money. And simply, we're not going to change their mind by telling them. I do think, and maybe I'm really stupid here, I do think it's really fortunate that the richest man in the world is Elon Musk. When you look at his own life, look at how he behaves, look at his beliefs, he really thinks he's going to colonize Mars. And who he wants to colonize Mars by. If Elon and Donald were charismatic and sleek and kind of slightly convincing, I think it'd be much more dangerous. And I'm hopeful.
Convince some people, it's not you.
Not me, no. Well, I'm convinced enough. So, and people in the USA, remember, half the population aren't voting. So you've only got to convince 25%. And it's not even convincing them. You've got to put 25% in a situation where what they've been given is so awful, including the Democrats telling them that things are getting better when they're not, that they do this a little bit. Let's try a bit like I looked at the Brexit vote a lot. And the interesting thing, I still have managed to get it over. The Brexit vote was higher in the south of England than the north, even though the south boundary line has slightly fewer people. It's higher amongst social class A, B, and C1 because people in the lower social groups were less likely to vote. We stereotyped it as Sunderland and Stoke, but it was Hampshire. And it's not quite the same with Trump, but there is a tendency to say it's hillbillies. Now, hillbillies don't vote, right? So this is mildly well-off white folk in rural and suburban.
Yeah, I think in 2016, when they did the comparison between Trump and Hillary Clinton, I think they actually said that she got the lion's share of the low-income voter there. That was defined in the question.
Yeah.
And that seemed to surprise people, so that very much is in line with what you just said.
Yeah, it's...
Same principle.
But enough people, and there's a big group of largely men, and particularly in intelligentsia, who do think Elon was onto a winner. Libertarian, high-tech, IT, future of the species is getting to another planet. That's diminished. But the Royal Society, right, our most eminent academic body, right? Yeah. In fact, the only body where it's not going to happen because I'm a geographer. Only 4 geographers have ever been given a FRS, which is like the highest title you can get as an academic. But the only society I actually take seriously is the Royal Society. They gave Musk an honorary fellowship. So they were, yeah. Oh, and then they've tried, what's legal? They discussed expelling him because he broke almost every, they've got a code of conduct, like all people. He's managed to break almost every line in the code of conduct. Including threatening another fellow, which is... he's a disruptor. The problem is, they've only got 600 million, and if they were to expel him, he might try and sue them. Or worse, and you've got to think, what would you do if you were on the board of the Royal Society? Name them as enemies of the people, so that somebody out there in the world might kill one of them. And imagine it. So they should never have made him one. But so it's not just those American, the Royal Society of Britain are most eminent, cleverest mathematicians and physicists made Musk a fellow.
It's true, but in the past few weeks I spoke to 4 different Trump supporters.
Yeah.
British.
Yeah.
And they've all been a bit deluded, in my view. So they've followed a narrative, but it's a narrative that I'm listening to them live and going, that's just nonsense.
But they're still with him at the moment. Because what we're getting here, on the car on the way up, I listened to Radio 4, okay. But what Radio 4 were doing on their little 10-minute segment in America was essentially character assassination of Trump. I mean, I completely agreed with it, and they were trying to do it really politely, which made it more effective, But other countries are more saying to their populations, this is really dangerous. But the world's also playing a game of don't say it too quickly to be singled out. Just work out how can we get the things we need from somewhere else, and who else can buy the stuff we sell so that we can just not be involved in the USA. But I sat at high table yesterday with a Trump supporting senior professor, American, who supported Trump because he's going to get apparently the anti-Semites out of the universities in America. And this is a high up professor in my university, and once he's got the anti-Semites out of Harvard, Trump will leave the universities alone, he said to me. Now, what I take from this is we are remarkably equal as human beings. And I've worked all my life in universities, right? Universities are full of people who are good at particular things, but it doesn't mean they're cleverer, just like the Royal Society making that mistake. I could be wrong. My colleague who loves Trump could be right. Harvard might, I don't know, chuck out all the students who've ever signed a thing in support of Palestine, and suddenly Trump gives them money. I just don't think it's likely. But take reform at the moment. I mean, 25% of people in the poll will tell you, if there was an election tomorrow, I'd vote for them. We know in 2024 how many people did, which was higher than expected. Sunak probably called the election early because he could see it rising. But reform, literally what's on the label. It is something different. I used to work for 10 years at the University of Sheffield, and I don't know if you have it here with your students. Sometimes there's like at the start of a course, as you can sign on to which courses you want. We used to have tables where students would come and we'd sign them up. And we had one course that was called TBA, which was to be announced. Well, it had no title. And the tragedy was more students signed up for that course than any of our other geography courses on offer, kind of out of hope. And it did make me think we really do need to be offering more exciting courses than that one.
I suppose you wonder if it's the why do people vote for these extreme positions? Maybe it's as basic as I don't know what I want, but I don't want that.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, and I don't want any more of that. Yeah, and if it's all been, go on.
Fundamentally, do you think information and facts actually cause real change in how people behave? Are human beings perfectly rational through facts and information and they'll change their behavior? Or do you think are they more driven by emotion? And you should concentrate on, as people trying to bring change in society, you should concentrate on stimulating some of those emotions. Now, I'll bring in one of my favorite characters into this, Gary Stevenson. You're familiar with him?
Yes, him.
Yeah. He's sending out a very coherent message, not completely rational and not completely based on facts, but he appeals to the emotion of people.
Yes.
And I think that kind of resonates with me. The current voting for reform is one thing.
It depends on. I'm obviously not. I'm a geographer, right? So I'm not. But it depends on what you're trying to do. So my granddad was born in 1916, and I've got some of his diaries. And when he was a student, and he was a man of his time, he thought women were lower and so on. And what's fascinating is him recording going to meetings of suffragettes. Now, I think he was partly going because he went to university where it was only men. So he wanted to see some women. And but his diaries are fascinating over, they might have a good point here or there, and you could see facts slightly changing mind. It's how I think if you want to have lasting change, you present something that is factually true, but with emotion. So the big one for Britain, my granddad, like many, most people in the 20s or 30s believed in eugenics and did believe the middle class were clever, working class were stupid. The way in which we presented the concentration camp footage when it first came, it wasn't obviously mass murder or Holocaust is awful, but if you present it in cinemas the way we did, there was a sudden change in attitude about eugenics and so on then. And the thing was completely factual, but we could have, well, other massacres, India, or what we did in, we have, as a country, we have not presented many ways in which we have helped kill millions and millions of people at all. So, the one I always think is fascinating is British children have no idea the Opium Wars or 100 years of Shane in China. So, the minute you go away from facts, it's dangerous, and you can do that for length of time. But you're on sound of footing. You want to actually want to know what the packaging. So I was in Cambridge on Saturday, and we were doing a debate, and the debate was a difficult one. I wouldn't, but it was this house would abolish private schools, which is quite tricky to win. And they put me. I said I'd do either side, but they put me on the abolish side. And I was with Terry, who's a journalist, and Aaron, who's a professor, and we were against three rather grand people. And we won the debate, and we won it by using emotion. And I felt a bit bad, but I wanted to win. I did tell them, right? But we got it really high because we got the audience to vote before we began. There's lots of facts being thrown at them all the time, but it was the using the emotions of snobbery, posh, is this fair, and jokes. And then what I saw happen, I think, was, and this is a middle-class Cambridge audience in the Cambridge Union, I watched them wanting to go with the winners, and the voting was on Slido, so it was anonymous. So nobody would know how they voted, but there's this thing of wanting to be with the feeling in the room. And that's that. And I felt a bit bad because I thought, is it a bit bullying? What are you actually? On the other hand, I thought scientifically, this is an interesting experiment, and I don't have to feel that bad about people who come to a Cambridge literary event, experimenting on pretty well-off, clever people. But it's tricky because, particularly if you're a kind of large middle-class white man, the doing emotion, like Boris Johnson or Trump, and if you work in universities, it should be rational, calmer, not. We ended the debate quoting from a speech, a man who was about to be killed or not killed, and a speech about educational statistics, and rose it to a crescendo, and the speech was about, it is so unjust that some children have 6 times more spent on education than others, and I've forgotten, up and up and up, and then revealed that the speech was called A Truth for Which I'm Prepared to Die, and the man who was giving the speech before the judge decided to kill him or not was Nelson Mandela, and it was a speech about segregating children, but that's all about emotion. It's all factual true, but what we were doing was getting the emotions up at the audience about dividing children, and lots of feelings of nice little children. I have a dream that little brown and little white, kind of all that. And part of me feels a bit dirty when you win things partly on emotion.
Yeah, but of course, I've heard, and I'm sure you've heard, probably everybody in this room has heard, that the left, and I admit I identify with that side of the political spectrum, has often been told we should do more of it by emotion. I mean, taking on board the arguments you make about possibly being dirty and so forth.
Yeah.
Nonetheless, the notion is always that the right seems to be very good at going burn, the left says, no, let's do facts.
Yeah.
There's a notion that when Clinton did this economy stupid, he got the balance right, but most of the time it generally isn't. It does bother me, because so going back to another area, and I sort of think of the rise of extremism, and I'm thinking, I think if you do the emotion side, you say, oh, it's 1930s. Now that's
Yeah.
Looking at most people now, it's not going to mean a great deal. They might study it in school, and the parents would, but it's not history. And you can get accused of alarmism. So for me, I am genuinely scared because I can see enough parallels and things used. I've got some connection with that history. But I want to think of a proactive thing which says, no, it actually doesn't have to. What do we have to do to get it? If people don't realise the danger or don't see any connection, what do you do? Is it emotion?
Yeah.
Is it rational? How do you actually...
So the left tends to go for not one great leader. And if you think about successful left-wing countries in Europe, Finland's best government before the current one was 4 women in the coalition, and the prime minister had been brought up by 2 women and so on. Attlee, our great post-war leader, was worse than Jeremy Corbyn at speaking, and bumbling and so on from Limehouse and that. It was only, and Iron Bevan was the one hard-hitting one. But there's a kind of rational, and it may well be that if the left had good orators, there wouldn't be a right. But I think part of what it means to be left is more collective, more rational, a set of people who are. So that 1960s governments that I think were very good had a series of able ministers. Or put it another way, one of the left's most able speakers was Tony Benn. And lovely man, but actually not who you wouldn't put a Viscount in front of a. It's not Gary, but also you can only win on the right if you, well, for a start, you believe that most people are stupid. You can't tell them what you believe because they're not going to vote for you. You have to get them scared about other things like immigration. You've got to distract them. You've got to have great oratory. You've got to have leadership, and you take Hitler and Mussolini and Fu and Trump. You can't make a rational right-wing argument for, trickle down. It doesn't. It's silly anyway. The minute you get into the details, tariffs are going to make us all richer. You don't want people thinking about it. You might be doing tariffs for a particular reason, but there may. But coming back to geography, if you look at different European countries, most of which have got PR, and they've got 8 or 9 parties, then the number of very ranty, famous folk, I think, is much less. The most successful European leader, I reckon, is Angela Merkel, whose politics are to the left of Corbyn. But anyway, if you actually look at the policies, you're going to...
I think I disagree with using emotions like dirty.
Yeah.
I guess corrupt or something. I feel like the reason why emotion needs to be used more is to just kind of create people to have more empathy for the people below them or whatever. Because I think the issue, as a lot of people are very individualistic.
Yeah.
People don't have understanding of other people's situations, which is the reason why they don't care about them, because they are in a better situation. That's all that matters. And I think emotion needs to be used more to be able to explain that to kind of prevent as well.
Okay.
People.
I agree, but I think you could do it, but I can't because you're younger. You'll come over as more honest and not having another agenda. Whereas for me, you could tell it'll be an act I'm putting on. I'd have had to learn how to do it.
Unless you're online and you pretend to be her.
Yes, but so when you see younger people at political events talking about what they care about, it's often full of emotion, it's raw, and it's completely true. Right? They are not trying to fool people about their opinions. And it's really interesting, and it's why I used to go to World Transformers things and sit at the back, often thinking, why am I it's quite nice to be the oldest person. And it's true. When people of my age put on emotions, very often they're actually lying. I don't know. Keir Starmer, rolling up your sleeves. Keir and Wes are always rolling up their sleeves at the moment. Now, they might really believe, that they are going to make Britain build again, or somebody's told them you've got to roll your sleeves up and you've got to put the hard hat on, and older people, and more often maybe men, you can tell me if I'm getting this wrong, but are more often putting on an act when they say they care, but not necessarily the right-wing ones. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong.
But the problem is, there'll be plenty of politicians who do care, and obviously we're owned by all the usual criteria. And I don't think it's healthy that we've seen all politicians are the bad guys. I can get it very easily how easy it is to get into that mindset, and how vulnerabilities we've discussed or hinted at come to make that more likely. But for politicians who are genuinely speaking good faith, want to be the lead, aren't bullshitting, how do you say they could get the point across? Because they're coming up against the wall of cynicism across the political spectrum. What should they be doing?
Some come over as much more believable than others. It worries me. Like, I had a friend who did her PhD. Going to worry you a minute. Did her PhD on fake smiles, because our ability to spot whether somebody is genuinely smiling or whether they're doing a fake smile. And one problem is that television is full of fake smiles. So we, our grandparents were not exposed to a world in which everybody is happy and smiling. And if you are a successful MP, if I was an MP, I could go around being normal. The hardest day of my life for this was actually here at Skipton, where I got married. Because if you get married, one thing you have to do is smile all day. Because when there is somebody taking pictures all the time, right? And I'm a fairly happy, smiley person, but honestly, now, if you're filmed for telly and you're trained, one thing you're told to do is exaggerate like this all the time. If you watch them on Newsnight or something, you'll see their arms going all over the place. Gesticulate, look a bit like you're on cocaine, even when you're not. Robert Peston was always really good at this. Slightly ridiculously over-enthusiastic. And just stop and watch. And if they don't do that, it's quite boring. And that's my worry, is that we've become used to entertainment, more in Britain, more of the US kind of society. Boring politicians are more allowed in more interesting, equal countries. One problem is that people who get bored then leave and come to London. So London's full of people from more equal countries that, really have got bored of how predictable everything is. But anyway, go on. And we should stop soon, shouldn't we? Yeah.
I think one of the problems is we live in the moment now, don't we? And we're with the thing on Facebook and everything. And one of your graphs was about war and so on.
Yeah.
And the figures were 2 or 3 years out of date.
Yes, they stopped in 2022. Yeah.
Obviously, I looked at that Ukraine and thinking of Gaza and everything, just thinking this is just completely out of date. And I think that's
it's tricky. Yeah.
A mistake we make as older people, because youngsters are just living in the moment and what's going on at the moment. That just turns me off straight away, because I watch the news every night and there with the horrible things that are going on at the moment.
Yeah, and we do concentrate. So we've had a slight rise in wars ever since the American wrote a book called something like Better Angels of Our Nature. I've forgotten. He's called an academic. War deaths were going down worldwide, really interestingly. People were becoming much less violent. Murders were overall. And war was, until about 16 years ago. Then we've had a small rise, but it's still quite low compared to the 1970s or 80s and 60s. There is growing intolerance to war in the world, particularly as women increasingly are in positions of power. And when you look at, it's only the poor of the world. We don't allow people to die of wars in rich countries much anymore. And it's terrible what's still happening, but compared to what used to happen, it's sort of going the right way. But the problem is that the news is always about the latest atrocity. It isn't about the dying that isn't happening, or the things that are getting better. Infant mortality falling almost everywhere. And when you do get people trying to do good news stories, it begins to feel a bit trite. There was a Positive News Times produced, probably by a church group, I suspect, trying to recruit, but it was a newspaper full of just nice things. And I remember the first time I saw it, I thought that was nice, and then I saw the second edition, I thought, oh, more kind of slightly nice things going on, not the shock horror of news. So I don't have a... The New York Times every year used to produce a graph of far-right voting in each country in Europe and what it had been in the past. And they coloured the far-right, for some reason, deep red, which I think because United States, that's the way round. Yeah. And so you looked at the graph, it looked terrible. But then if you just recoloured it, shaded the graph differently, you could see that half the European countries had got falls in far-right voting. And that's what I mean about reporting. Golden Dawn in Greece, which was a really nasty organisation, being partly banned by women judges, having almost no power now. These are good things when they happen. I can remember the National Front. I mean, we still got, but you know.
But also, there's things like which I know have some idea of the UK, and I'm sure various data exists in other countries across Europe and the West. Is why people are voting for the far right. So you've got Not Hate who do regular surveys on that, and without going into detail, there are various different categories of people across various sort of strata about why they vote. And it'll be interesting to compare such data in the UK versus if there's similar organisations collecting it in Germany, in France, in Belgium, what have you, and try and understand sort of what patterns are. And if nothing else, it will provide quite useful predictive value, though obviously there's the caveat that we have first past the post, but nonetheless it might give you some sort of more global assessment of what's motivating people, whether it is something purely to do with individual countries or whether there's any...
I'll end on this one, or one interesting one. You never... On recent elections in Europe, there's been breakdowns by age and gender on voting. And it's always under 24s that we're interested in. And in the recent German election, the votes for the Left Party amongst young women were incredibly high. And the votes for the Right Party amongst young men were higher. And I won't do this, I made some trite joke, actually in Cheltenham Ladies College. I made some trite joke that if the young men wanted to impress young women, maybe believing in the political party they voted for might help, but that went down completely flat, and you can't do that anymore. But there is a little bit of an angry young men, an angry older men thing occurring, including in the US. I mean, Trump makes it easy by being nasty to women.
In Headingley last week, 38-year-old in Headingley who died yesterday.
Yeah.
Do you not know?
No. Tell me.
I think he was taking offence at the Oxley Run, the students go and fancy dress and go popular and he wanted to. He was against that, I think.
Yeah.
It's misogynistic, wasn't it? It's against
misogynistic, and that's the thing. He fired a crossbow at two women.
No. Really?
They both survived. He didn't.
Yeah. Although another way, not knowing that, but one thing which I think is quite incredible when you think about it is how few people actually resort to that kind of thing. We're not a bad species if you actually.
It's whether how we get from people who have ideas which get into the mainstream, however we define it, to ideas which we consider problematic and potential to violence, and then the ones who do go into who actually move into violence now. Yeah.
And the effect of a single, in Norway, that single person attacking the children on that island of Norway is still terrible, but we don't talk about how incredible it is that when people are really angry, most of us don't resort, but inside our families. Last one?
It's not a question. I was just going to say that one last question, and then we can go have refreshments. And before that, closing towards refreshments because they will be locking the building.
Let's do closing words. Let's do closing words. Yeah.
Yeah, it was a great discussion though. On behalf of the Leeds Beckett University Humanist Student Society and the Leeds Humanist UK group, a huge thank you to Danny for such a fascinating talk.
Thank you.